We're going to be talking gentlemen's agreements on today's NUFC Transfer Daily as Alexander Isak and Yoane Wissa both take the same approach to trying to leave their clubs this summer. We'll also be discussing a potential striker target that Newcastle may have missed an opportunity on. Let's get into it. Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Please do get involved by hitting the subscribe button and the like button on this video. Join the community, help me grow a little bit bigger, getting closer to 1,800 subscribers, not too far away from 2,000, which is absolutely incredible considering that I was aiming for 1,000 over the summer. So thanks so much to everyone for your support. Let's keep it going. Today we're going to be looking more at Yoane Wissa and Alexander Isak with their gentlemen's agreements and promises broken angles on their attempting to try and move away from their clubs, and how Newcastle fans are being called hypocrites because the club is chasing Wissa, while also criticising Alexander Isak for doing very similar things. And in this video I'm going to be discussing them both in the same breath and basically dispelling any myths that many Newcastle fans are on Wissa's side and not on Isak's, and treating them differently, because I certainly am not. I think that the whole thing is ridiculous, and I've said previously about Wissa that Brentford are well within their rights to discuss whatever price they want. Was there a promise that he could leave? It's very convenient that that's coming out now. The same with Alexander Isak and promises broken in his statement the other day. A little bit more reaction. I also do have a piece on Isak's situation and what might happen next that's gone up on Forbes yesterday. I'll link that in the description too. And also we're going to be discussing a potential failed striker target, someone who I think Newcastle should have gone for, that looks set to move elsewhere for a deal that would have just solved, I think, a lot of problems this summer, and that is Victor Boniface, who's going to AC Milan on loan with an option for a €30 million deal. So we'll talk about him a little bit later, but I really just want to focus on this whole gentleman's agreement thing. And yesterday I sort of jokingly tweeted, you can see it in the thumbnail, because Fabrizio Romano tweeted, Yoane Wissa thought he had a pact with Brentford to leave the club, and I said pacts aren't facts. That's quite a silly little jokey thing, but it's so true, really. I think the sentiment is absolutely correct, that you can't just decide to leave a club because somebody said something to you and promised something to you. And there was a really good point in discussions about Isak on TalkSport yesterday. I'm not a big listener of TalkSport, I don't really get involved with it, but Simon Jordan was the clip of Simon Jordan went round, and I really agreed with what he said, which is, surely if there's a gentleman's agreement, it's in the agent's interest to get it written down. It's in the player's interest to get it on a contract. You can't just assume that you've got an agreement with a club, because every club will only look after themselves. Loyalty doesn't exist in football, and we're seeing that from the player side in these two cases, but we're also seeing it from club sides as well. And Newcastle, look at Isaac Hayden, wasn't wanted to train with the reserves. Look at Callum Wilson this summer, is no longer of the level. Clubs and players benefit and are at the behest of a lack of loyalty. And that quote from Roy Keane, if you want loyalty, get a dog. That's just the reality of football. And I wrote a piece on downing tools and how selective people can be about things like this. Liverpool fans saying that Trent Alexander-Arnold, who never downed tools, was a problem because he ran his contract down, but they're absolutely fine with Isak doing this. Newcastle fans, some I have seen, are okay with Wissa doing what he's doing, but criticising Isak. I think most football fans who support these things are mostly just focused on their own club and will bend the rules if it benefits their club and themselves. And I think, unfortunately, that's just the natural way of things. But if you're wanting something in your contract, like a release clause, like a way out, first of all, in the case of Isak, why didn't his agent get that? 6-year contract and giving his best years over to Newcastle effectively without a route out. And we've seen this is exactly like the Harry Kane situation. This is why I'm so confident that Isak can still come back, because Kane was a local boy at Spurs. He was a Spurs man. He decided to step away from training. He wasn't going to be done. It was very close to him going to Manchester City. He thought he was there, whereas Isak's never been in that position where he's nearly at Liverpool. It's just been something that I think he's felt like he had to force, and he's basically torched his legacy at Newcastle, which is really sad, but he's been willing to do that to try and, on the promise and the proviso that he might be able to get this move. And that's a bit ridiculous in my head, but he's chosen to do it, but that doesn't mean that he's going to get it. And his agent is a massive reason why that's the case, because there was no release clause in his contract. And then to go back and say you can have, a promise of a new contract, I have more sympathy with that, because I think he is worthy of a bigger pay rise, and I think the club have really fumbled that over the last couple of years. I mean, Staveley promising it in a situation with PSR as it was at the time was probably as bad as Mitchell then reneging on it, not thinking of the human consequences of it. Absolutely, if you read and listen to what I've said over the summer, I think I've been quite consistent on actually understanding Isak's perspective on a lot of things. But I think since the going AWOL, since not telling Eddie Howe that he was going to Spain, again, I didn't really have an issue with him going to Spain by its, in itself, but going to Spain and not telling Eddie Howe, and then treating Eddie Howe and treating the players like he has in the last couple of weeks, has really sort of shown a really dark side of this whole thing for me, and I think that's a real problem. But going back to the gentleman's agreement thing, if you have that gentleman's agreement, get it written down. And it's very interesting that it was never mentioned at any previous point. I don't mean by Isak or the agent. I mean, I'm talking about people like Fabrizio Romano, David Ornstein, these people who the narrative has developed around what they've been reporting, absolutely fairly, by the way. They're just reporting what they're told. But there was none of that at the time, at the start of the summer. Suddenly all this is emerging at a time when Liverpool are there and not working, and it's all very convenient. And I think that's really disingenuous. So this idea that you can get yourself out of a club, and let's talk about Wissa, because I can already hear people in the comment section, well, you're only focusing on Isak. Wissa's no different, because this idea that he was promised this move, and I understand why he would want that move, because Brentford are in a difficult situation with their forward line. They've lost now Brian Mbeumo. They obviously lost Ivan Toney a couple of years ago. They've lost Thomas Frank. And we will talk about Thomas Frank and Spurs and that whole thing that's been emerging yesterday. Newcastle, by the way, did have a bid rejected for Wissa yesterday, 35 plus 5 million. You can't just expect that your actions are going to get you out of the club. When you're Brentford at the moment, and I mentioned they do have Igor Thiago and Kevin Schade, who are both decent strikers as well. But when you're Brentford in that situation and you've lost all you've lost and you've really struggled to replace them, and they were outclassed quite considerably by Nottingham Forest at the weekend, you're not looking at that and thinking that we're going to facilitate this move for Wissa on his terms, in the same way that Newcastle can't with Isak. He should be training, he should be working hard, he should be doing his job. They have an option on a second year of his contract, so the idea that he's got a year left and that makes it easier to get him out isn't necessarily true as well. He's agreed to this deal, and this idea that players are fixated on broken promises and gentlemen's agreements, they're actually contracted and they've actually signed a promise to play for the club and get paid a handsome wage. The premise of a gentleman's agreement really frustrates me, because there's no reason for it. There's no way you can say it. Nobody's naming anybody. Isak's not named Staveley or named Mitchell or named anybody, because that makes it real. It's very easy just to say it and put yourself in a position where you're not making yourself accountable. And that's in a positive way for Isak in terms of his statement yesterday. The fact that he said right now, and I wrote this in the piece yesterday on Forbes, the fact that he wrote right now I can't do this means that he can still step back. So there's still a route in to the club and route into reconciliation from even that sort of point of which appears to be the end of it all, and the sort of point of no return. It's the point of no return, as I wrote in the piece, in terms of it's all public. Newcastle have come out, Isak's come out, but both have still got very much an approach in that thing where you can come back. Newcastle have welcomed him back. They've also said that they've listened. They've tried to be reasonable, but they've definitely gone on the attack as well in that statement. But if the fundamental thing is promises, Isak and Whissa are saying that they want promises to be kept, but they're not keeping their promise. And you don't sign up to a club to play, you sign up to a club to train. You're paid to go to training every day, do your best, prepare for the club that pays your wages. And I'm no happier with Yoane Wissa for doing what he's doing to Brentford in the situation that they're in than I am with Alexander Isak doing what he's doing to Newcastle. Because I know in Newcastle's case, because I've spoken to people, that they've tried their best, and we've seen it. They've gone from £150 million being a massive amount of money that was designed to deter people, to being an actual hard valuation for Liverpool to potentially meet to get this deal done. on the proviso that there's replacements who come in, one of whom is Ekitike and one of whom was Benjamin Sesko. Both failed, and there's a conversation I was having with a Liverpool fan in the comment section. You're probably watching this one now, and Liverpool fans have seen on social media. I understand the sort of thing of, well, didn't Newcastle say that they wanted to play him together with Isak when Ekitike was the target for Newcastle, and Liverpool shouldn't be blamed for going in for him? I'm not necessarily blaming Liverpool for going in for Ekitike and taking away from Newcastle, and it was the idea to play them together. But I think ultimately what it would have meant was Liverpool would have then needed Isak more, needed a striker more, would have probably then pushed harder for Isak, and Newcastle would have been more accepting of a potential deal because they've got Ekitike. That's the point I'm making. So Liverpool can't be blamed for taking Ekitike, that was their choice, but they've made it more difficult for themselves and made it more difficult for Newcastle to sell Ekitike. That's not blame, that's just the reality, and that was their choice, and that's absolutely fine. But that's why Newcastle are in a difficult spot for selling Isak now. I think they're hoping to show that they've tried, and I think there's lots of evidence for doing that. But Isak's got to come back and reintegrate and apologise, just like Whissa has to if he isn't going to get that move. Obviously, with Whissa, the whole thing with Richarlison and the Eberechi Eze thing is now he's going to Arsenal, so that's off the table. But Spurs wanting Whissa, whether that's the case because Whissa really wants Newcastle, by the sounds of it, Keith Downey saying it's a thing to do with the history of African players at Newcastle and him wanting the number 9 shirt, and he's got his heart set on Newcastle. We'll see how that plays out. But yeah, I find this whole thing very distasteful, and I understand why people are criticising Newcastle fans. Some Newcastle fans, again, most people in the comment section, most people I've seen on social media do not condone these things. But some Newcastle fans are, and it's easy for opposition fans to say, well, how is it okay for Whissa but not okay for Isak? And I'm here to say it absolutely isn't. Whissa should be training with Brentford. Whissa should be doing what he can to help Brentford in the meantime, and that would probably help him get his move. They're probably digging in the way that Newcastle have with Alexander Isak. It's now harder for Isak to leave, not just because of the conditions not being met, but also because Newcastle it's a pride issue. Newcastle want to save face. Optically, it's really terrible to sell Isak. So that's all come from his actions. So I hope that clears up a lot of things. I do not condone either of these players. We'll see if Whissa joins. There are other options out there. Wilson is an easier player to replace than Isak, so there are plenty of strikers that Newcastle can get who can play behind Isak instead of replacing him. One of whom was, I think, could have been an option was Victor Boniface, who's joining AC Milan on loan this season with a €30 million option. He's had some injury problems. He's only played 19 league games for Bayer Leverkusen last season, but scored 8 goals, 14 the previous season. He's proven at the top 5 level, and that I think proven at the top 5 level in Europe, at the top 5 leagues, is more important than Premier League because value is there, and we're seeing that with Boniface. I mean, that's a great deal for AC Milan to go and get him for that money, even at the end of a loan, and it would have been ideal because Newcastle could have spent that money next summer on next summer's accounts, all of those things. And I've said that loans are more possible, and Boniface feels like it could have been something that would have been a really ideal signing. Physically very good. He's had some injury problems, a couple of cruciate knee ligament injuries years ago, but he's really recovered from that, I think, generally, and done really well. For Leverkusen, it was a massive reason why they won the Bundesliga under Xabi Alonso 2 seasons ago now, and I think Milan have got a really good player there that Newcastle should have, I think, gone for. He's 24 years old, he's a physical, powerful lad, can run the channels, that type of striker that Newcastle would really like. Champions League experience, proven at the very top level, and could Newcastle have pushed the boat out and gone and signed him? I have no insight on whether they wanted him or whether it's possible, but it just goes to show, I think, that Newcastle have options up front, and they don't need to be held to ransom by Brentford, but Brentford also don't need to be held to ransom by Yoane Wissa, and that's why I think this is so difficult, because Brentford also know that Newcastle are desperate. That's why they're pushing the price up. It looks like it's going to be at least 45 million, possibly even 50 million. Like we said, weeks ago, that was the initial valuation. Some people said that it was 60 million this week, and other people have said that they're not putting a value on it. It's feeling a little bit Crystal Palace, Mark Gahey like, and they've already done this with Manchester United as well, and and Brian Mbeumo. They've really made life difficult, as is their right, and I fully support their position in doing this because they're in relegation trouble. I've said this. If Newcastle go and sign Jørgen Strand Larsen from Wolves, that means that you're really putting Wolves under pressure to survive this season. And if you go and sign Yoane Wissa from Brentford, the absolutely same thing. So I think this one's quite difficult to do. I said the other day, should Newcastle move away from Yoane Wissa? And there are plenty of options that we've discussed on the channel this summer in Europe, and I think lots of strikers that can come in and do a job behind Isak and really challenge Isak, one of whom could have been Victor Boniface, in my opinion. I saw that last night and I was really, really disappointed that Newcastle hadn't made that move, because it felt ideal, especially at that price and with that availability for Milan, which is a great signing. So I'm sure he'll do really well there, but he could have been excellent competition for Isak this season. Let me know what you think on my little bit of a rant. I would say this is as close to a rant as I'm going to get on this channel. What my thoughts on and my thoughts on Victor Boniface. What do you think about Newcastle striker situation with just under a couple of weeks left of the window? Thanks so much for joining me, and I'll see you next time.